Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to address you today and speak about the future of research into reparations for Nazi victims. This is a topic of great importance and urgent necessity that concerns us all. Over the past decades, we have intensively dealt with how we as a society can provide reparations to the victims of National Socialism. This is not only about financial compensation, but also about symbolic recognition and moral reparation. Research in this area has produced important, end of quote. So how does it work? Next slide, please. Unfortunately, a technical problem not only now, but also then occurred at this point, and ChatGPT interrupted further processing my request. Write a Constantin Goschler style keynote on the future of the history of reparations for Nazi victims, unquote. So we will never know what new research ChatGPT wanted to unveil. Willy-nilly, I need to think about the subject myself. For that purpose, I will first look backwards in order to put the status quo of research into the recognition and compensation of Nazi injustice into a genealogical perspective. Okay, thank you. Subsequently, I will look forward and offer some observations on the challenges we face and also some suggestions as to where future academic research in this area might be heading. Now let's see if this works better than ChatGPT. Okay, great. In some respects, research into material and symbolic reparations for Nazi victims falls outside the framework of customary historical research. For long stretches, research was conducted in parallel with the historical process itself, and quite often the threads of historical events and historical research were interwoven. To a certain extent, this is still true today, even if the interweaving has become less intense in the meantime, but only to reappear all the more violently elsewhere. For example, in the context of the current debate on reparations for colonial crimes. The special constellation in the field of research on reparations for Nazi crimes means that we must pay special attention to the role of different actors if we want to explain the research cycles. For in this field, the interpretation of the past is not a monopoly of professional historians. Rather, one could speak of this as a field of public history in which the impetus for scholarly research into the subject matter often came from actors outside academia. We must therefore pay attention to the characteristic network of scholars, actors, and activists, and the fluid transitions that exist between these groups. The mixture of actors is particularly characteristic for the beginnings of research into the history of reparations for Nazi crimes, which can be located in the 1970s and 1980s. Two strands can be distinguished here. On the one hand, there was a first attempt by the Federal Ministry of Finance to declare the reparations for National Socialist injustice, the so-called Wiedergutmachung, a closed history, even in the 1970s. Under the direction of the Jewish lawyer Walter Schwarz, a luminary in the field of restitution law, a 6-volume series entitled Die Wiedergutmachung nationalsozialistischen Unrechts durch die Bundesrepublik Deutschland, the reparation of National Socialist injustice by the Federal Republic of Germany, was produced. The authors of the thick cloth-bound volumes were mostly legally trained staff from the Department of the Federal Ministry of Finance responsible for this field of work. The titles in this series disdained all the laws of the book market. And when Walter Schwarz asked a colleague for advice and a friendly review of his volume, Rückerstattung unter den Gesetzen der alliierten Mächten, Restitution under the Laws of the Allied Powers, published in 1974 as a prelude to the series, the latter advised him to change the title to attract more public interest. His ironic suggestion was Sex and Restitution. Walter Schwarz, whose life's work was the representation of Jewish restitution claims, had placed himself in the service of the efforts of the Federal Ministry of Finance at that time to shift restitution as a supposedly soon-to-be completed field of work into the area of legacy. This expectation was not fulfilled, and instead Walter Schwarz eventually became the target of angry young Germans in the late 1980s. This was due, at least indirectly, in no small part to the very colleague who had given Walter Schwarz the friendly advice to choose a more marketable title for his book. It was Benjamin B. Ferencz, who himself successfully followed the rules of successful title design with a book published in 1979, Less Than Slaves, Jewish Forced Labor and the Quest for Compensation. In 1981, this book also appeared in a German translation, there under the no less lurid title Lohn des Grauens. Ferencz contrasted the administrative perspective of German ministry officials on reparation law with the perspective of an American Jewish lawyer who had spent many years fighting with German industry for compensation for former Jewish forced laborers on behalf of the Jewish Claims Conference. This book provided an important impetus for the civil society movement that emerged in the 1980s, which denounced the exclusion of numerous persecuted groups from the system of German compensation payments under the slogan of the forgotten victims, which already has been mentioned. The beginnings of research into the compensation of Nazi victims were thus primarily carried out by actors such as Schwarz and Ferencz on the one hand, and German civil society activists on the other, no historians. In the 1980s, the latter focused their interest primarily on those groups that had hitherto remained excluded from compensation. Detached from this research interest, a few international political science works emerged that dealt primarily with the German reparations for Israel. Lily Gardner-Feldman's study published in 1984 should be highlighted here. The emerging research thus went in very different directions. On the one hand, German reparations to Israel became a success story in international relations. On the other hand, the compensation of Nazi victims, especially in the Federal Republic, was primarily described as a story of scandal. A key work in this regard was the 1988 book by the physician Christian Pross, Wiedergutmachung, der Kleinkrieg gegen die Opfer, sounds even better in English, Reparations, the Guerrilla War against the Victims, which drew attention primarily to the re-traumatizing consequences of medical assessment in the context of compensation practice. The previously dominant civil law principle of compensation was now often contrasted with the socio-philosophical category of recognition. Thus, the Forgotten Victims campaign also became an important instrument of a new type of victimization policy, which linked recognition as a victim with claims for improved social participation. And at that time, this primarily referred to the Federal Republic. This was a very inside perspective in a way. In this way, the previous focus of the academic study of reparations for Nazi victims shifted from Jews to non-Jews. Often, this also became a contradiction or even a conflict, which is why the buzzword victim competition also gained importance during this time, which sometimes also affected the realm of academia. After the topic of reparations for victims of Nazi persecution had only gradually arrived in historical scholarship since the late 1980s, a broad research landscape finally developed in the 1990s. On the one hand, this was a reaction of the historical profession to the debate that had been conducted in the 1980s in West Germany under the banner of the Forgotten Victims. On the other hand, this was stimulated by the renewed political boom in the topic of reparations for Nazi victims after the end of the Cold War. The field of research then differentiated in various directions. Firstly, in the tradition of the Forgotten Victims debate, studies emerged that focused on individual groups of victims, with marginalized groups playing a special role. Secondly, the campaign triggered by the human rights-oriented politics of the USA of the 1990s under the motto, "Finishing the business of the Holocaust," played an important role, with Jewish victims again taking center stage. The strong Europeanization of the perspective in the 1990s is particularly noteworthy, which also led to the founding of historical commissions in some countries to research reparations to Nazi victims. Austria, Switzerland, and France should be highlighted here. Thirdly, one should also refer to the boom in transitional justice supported by political science, for which the West German reparations policy often served as a reference case. Although actors and activists still played a certain role even in the face of the emergence of a more disciplinarily regulated field of research on reparations for Nazi victims, the significance of this group declined overall. The extent to which research conjunctures are dependent on political conjunctures became apparent when the Europe-wide wave of new reparations regulations for Nazi victims soon subsided after the turn of the millennium. As a result, historical research also soon declined sharply again. To a certain extent, the great exception here confirms the rule. For art restitution, in particular, developed into a central subject of political debate, and this triggered not only the upswing in provenance research, but also historical research into the restitution of cultural artifacts. This is where different developments come together. On the one hand, property often outlasts the span of an individual's life. Therefore, the debate about the restitution of so-called looted art develops at a different time rhythm than the compensation of damaged or destroyed biographies. On the other hand, under the influence of the post-colonial paradigm, the restitution question has developed far beyond its original limitation to confiscation processes in the context of National Socialist persecution. While the current research boom on confiscated and looted cultural assets thus points to unfinished restitution issues, the long announced, but now probably imminent farewell to the generation of Nazi victims also seems to be generating a new research boom, in which memory studies play an important role. This development is also influenced to some extent by changes in the political context. For example, it has already been mentioned, the Federal Ministry of Finance recently launched an archive portal for restitution, which we will also hear about this conference. The transfer of files from registries to archives means, both practically and symbolically, that a political and administrative process that is regarded as completed is now being shifted into the realm of history. But there is no doubt that this opens up important possibilities for future research, which we will certainly discuss intensively in the following 2 days. But how has interest in knowledge changed in the course of the research conjunctures briefly outlined here? I will attempt a systematic arrangement, knowing well that the actual circumstances are somewhat more complicated. Firstly, the political negotiation processes from which reparation regulations for Nazi victims, the BEG and so on, emerged were in the foreground. Increasingly, the dynamics of inclusion and exclusion, and thus also the mechanisms of definition, as well as the recognition or non-recognition of Nazi victims, were of particular interest. Secondly, this led to research that focused on the practice of restitution and compensation procedures. In this perspective, Nazi victims, as well as the various actors in restitution procedures, moved to the center. The history of reparations for Nazi victims now became a history of complex interactions between individual victims and representatives of the perpetrators in the medium of bureaucratic encounters. At the same time, research often shifted from the macro to the micro level. Thirdly, the question of the intergenerational memory of Nazi victims then moved to the center, continuing the movement towards the micro perspective. Here, in addition to historians, other disciplines, especially cultural studies, also deal with such questions. Conversely, however, there is also a trend towards a macro perspective of memory, which leads into a conflict that is central to both the present and the future of research in the history of reparations for Nazi victims. On the one hand, there are efforts by the organizations involved in the negotiation and implementation of reparations to create their own legacy. This concerns not only the Federal Ministry of Finance, already mentioned in this context, but also the Foundation Remembrance, Responsibility and Future, we know well about that, or also the Jewish Claims Conference, which recently has produced a movie which is a piece of legacy construction. What these efforts have in common is that they limit this legacy strictly to their own field of work. This is contrasted by an impulse that refers above all to Michael Rothberg's formula of multidirectional memory. Recently, this has led to a confrontation between Holocaust-oriented German memory culture and post-colonial memory culture, since the latter aims to include colonial crimes. This confrontation is also having an increasing impact on research into reparations for victims of Nazi persecution. In this context, the boundaries between academia and activism, which seem to have been fortified for a while, have become very permeable again. This brings us to the present and to the question of where the future development of research might lead. So hopefully tension is rising. It is likely that research on the history of reparations for victims of Nazi persecution will continue to pursue tried and tested paths. In this respect, this subject area is no different from other fields of research, which can be described using Thomas Kuhn's powerful metaphor as a succession of paradigm shifts and phases of normal scholarship, based on commonly shared basic academic assumptions and criteria of relevance. To illustrate this, for example, in neighboring subject areas, one could refer to Frank Bayot's study on Aryanization in Hamburg, which was then followed by numerous similar local studies, whereby at least the scientific novelty value began to decline at some point. The situation was similar with research on forced labor in the German Reich. After a heroic phase of research, so to speak, in which this topic often had to be pushed through by grassroots historians in the first place, a large wave of such research finally followed, which produced numerous detailed studies on companies and satellite camps. Here too, an effect eventually occurred whereby mostly already known results were substantiated with new examples. Similar effects could also occur if more and more individual case studies on reparations for Nazi victims are produced. So how do we deal with this tension that in the realm of academic research, at a certain point, there's nothing new, but on an existential level, every life is equally important. So somehow this is a decisive problem which we need to address in this context. To be clear, I'm by no means concerned with dismissing as worthless such research that empirically deepens known research results with new examples. Rather, it seems to me to make sense here to emphasize different aspects of historical culture. On the one hand, this includes the historiographical study of the past. This must not only be subject to certain disciplinary rules in order to be able to provide its interpretation with a claim to validity. Rather, it must also be measured against the research imperative that emerged in the 19th century, which ideally aims to surpass what is already known. From proper historiographical research, the memory cultural function of history can be distinguished. The latter could be described as a mixed zone in which professional historians and lay people meet. The culture of memory is primarily about individual and collective memories, which interact in many ways with the results of historical scholarship. It goes back and forth. There, it is a matter of institutionalizing approvable, binding understandings of the past that invite or also call for identification with communities of various kinds, from families to nations and beyond. In contrast to historiography, however, the commandment of novelty does not apply to the culture of remembrance, but rather the opposite, the commandment of repetition of the already known, which can have an identity-building effect in this way. Think to your last family gathering. This expectation also applies to the aforementioned efforts to make the history of reparations for Nazi victims part of the legacy of organizations. They try to turn their own share of this history into lasting cultural and political capital. Such an expectation is not in itself reprehensible, but belongs to the realm of organizational sociological self-evident facts. Nevertheless, the question arises as to how historical research relates to such developments. This is not a matter of schematic opposition. For example, according to the motto, here innovative research, there repetitive culture of remembrance. Such a distinction would correspond to a top-down model of science popularization, which has rightly been questioned for some time. Anyway, not all scholarly research is innovative, and time and again, important impulses for scholarly research have also come from historical laypersons. But as soon as historical topics and questions are taken up in this way by historical scholarship, they must be dealt with there according to the disciplinary standards that apply there. And this includes, in particular, respecting the modern distinction between myth and history. This opposition designates two different forms of explaining the world, which only the latter must submit to the claim of making its assertions verifiable and thus of doubt to risk having to revise statements. Without wanting to declare modernity itself a myth, as Horkheimer and Adorno did, it should be pointed out that the standards of historical scholarship themselves are also due to change. Notably, in our own time, many long-held self-evident disciplinary standards seem to have become highly controversial. One possible explanation might be that modernity is no longer blamed so much for creating new mythologies, as Horkheimer and Adorno did, but rather castigated as a product of Western colonial fantasies. I would therefore like to go a little further and reflect on the connection between the current history wars in the United States and the so-called Historikerstreit 2.0 in Germany. In the brief historiographical genealogy, which I have presented in the first part of my talk, I have already emphasized the strong interconnection of research and political debates. An important aspect of this special relationship is the important role of actors and activists with a concrete political agenda. A similar constellation has currently condensed into a veritable history war in the US. In August last year, James A. Sweet, the president of the American Historical Association, published an essay entitled, "Is History History? Identity Politics and the Teleologies of the Present." According to Sweet, history is increasingly being used as a ragbag from which all sides help themselves to support their own political positions. Instead of approaching the past according to the professional standards of historical scholarship, appropriate teleologies of the present were being created out of the needs of identity politics. his argument proceeds. As an example of this, Sweet cited the article A Case for Restitution, written by the American journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates, who had referred there to the model of the German reparations agreement with Israel and the Jewish Claims Conference in order to bolster his claim for reparations for slavery. Sweet took a severe beating for his polemic against the rise of presentism in historical scholarship, especially from colleagues who study the history of subaltern groups. He then apologized for his exaggerations, but this did not lead to the end of the still ongoing debate. Why am I speaking at such length about these events, which ostensibly concern only American historians? It seems to me that the core of the debate lies in the argument about the role of positionality in historical scholarship. This very question, it seems to me, was not only important in the past of the study of reparations for Nazi persecution, but will also be very significant in future research as well. In other words, what rules should apply to a researcher's relationship to his or her subject? The Weberian principle that has long prevailed, especially in German historiography, and which seeks to keep personal value judgments out of research, has for some time been challenged by the principle of a decidedly site-specific approach, more so in the US than in the Federal Republic. Such an approach mainly invokes to make the voices of marginalized groups audible that have long been excluded from the hegemonic discourse. The current history wars in the US thus lead directly to the so-called Historikerstreit 2.0 in the Federal Republic. As you will all know, the Australian expert on the history of genocide, Dirk Moses, recently rebuked the predominance of a Holocaust-oriented culture of remembrance in the Federal Republic. His polemic against the so-called German catechism transferred the lines of tension of the history wars to the German debate by claiming a contrast between a hegemonic and a marginalized culture of victim remembrance. Admittedly, he was primarily concerned with the different weight of the Holocaust and colonial crimes in memory culture. But this ties in with the older opposition in the study of reparations for Nazi victims, which can be traced back at least to the 1980s, and which can be seen above all in the opposition of Jewish victims and the so-called forgotten victims. So I think it's a great way to bring institutions together with the attempt to bridge this gap. So that's a really good thing. In my opinion, this conflict produces one of the central challenges for research into reparations for Nazi victims. Will we adopt a universalist perspective in which we try to examine the diversity of persecution and reparations as a problem? Or will we choose the diversity of different groups of victims as a starting point for examining these issues? I would like to make a personal confession here that it was precisely the first question that brought me to this subject era about some 35 years ago. My key experience was a panel discussion in the late 1980s at the Institute of Contemporary History in Munich, in which Walter Schwarz praised the reparations to Jewish Nazi victims as at least a relative success story, which he even described as a source of pride for the German people. On the other hand, all the other participants, at that time still exclusively male, each speaking for one of the so-called persecuted victim groups, agreed that the particular group they were addressing had suffered the worst fate under the reparations regime, thereby underlining a sharp contrast to the Jewish case as it was presented by Walter Schwarz. This kind of victim competition on stage, which apparently also affected the historians working on this field of inquiry, has interested me since then. My impression is that research into reparations for Nazi victims since the 1980s has been very much organized around the line of tension between Holocaust victims and the others. And it appears that this line of division might be protracted into the future, maybe not after this conference. However, in my opinion, the transformation of individuals into members of enemy groups by the National Socialists should not become the starting point for research into the reparations of Nazi victims. Rather, we should make a careful balancing act in which, on one hand, we take group-related National Socialist persecution seriously, and on the other hand, do not ourselves essentialize victim groups. Thomas Piketty described this challenge in the context of contemporary social struggles as the task of combating discrimination without hardening identities. I'm aware that I'm moving into contentious territory with this positioning, which argues against the pitfalls of identity politics. But I believe that we should have this argument. This leads me to my next and final point, where I would like to address a few questions that seem particularly important to me for future research into the history of reparations for Nazi victims. From the wealth of potential perspectives for future research on the history of reparations for Nazi victims, I would like to highlight 4 aspects that are particularly close to my heart. Of course, these questions primarily reflect my own preferences and are in no way meant to be exclusionary. So this was the disclaimer, the trigger warning. First, we should think more intensively about the boundaries of the problem we are researching. For the concept of Nazi persecution of Nazi victims entails a complicated problem. Linguistically, we could describe this problem with the contrast between 2 different ways how to understand historical concepts. In a semasiological perspective, we start from a phenomenon that is then designated. The starting point here would thus be a comprehensive understanding of persecution in the National Socialist sphere of rule, which ultimately also includes the consequences of the war. So this will mean that there will always another group of victims which so far has received no compensation, because this field is endless. On the other hand, in an onomasiological perspective, we start from a designation and then look at changing associated contents. The starting point here then are legal definitions of Nazi persecution, which, as is the nature of law, serve to define the boundaries of entitlement. Although the legal concept of Nazi persecution has also constantly expanded over the decades in the direction of wartime events, it is nevertheless much narrower than it might be applied in a semasiological perspective. My claim is that if we do not reflect theoretically on the problems which result from the use of these concepts, historical research will remain trapped in the conflict between legal and political definitions of Nazi persecution. Theoretical reflection of this sort appears to me especially important in view of new conceptual challenges posed by the increasing use of the concept of genocide. For future research on reparations for Nazi victims will increasingly be situated in the context of current political debates on new kinds of reparation claims. This leads me directly to my second point. The conceptual clarifications are at the same time a prerequisite for us to be able to place the object of investigation, reparations for Nazi victims, in a comparative perspective, as this conference also tries to do. Such comparisons can take place on several levels and scales and include both historical forms of reparations for historical violence, as well as present and future claims. The possible points of reference for such comparisons include not only, for example, the equalization of burdens and the provision of war victims in Germany, where some surprising points of overlap occasionally arise anyway. Such comparisons on a national level, which could also be carried out in countries other than Germany, are particularly important in order to discuss the extent to which the treatment of Nazi victims differed from that of other victim groups. Here, the challenge arises to question not only contemporary, but also our own ideas of the worthiness or unworthiness of different groups of victims. But numerous comparisons can also be thought of at the international level. For example, measures to compensate victims of dictatorship were part of the toolbox of transitional justice that developed in the 1990s. But also the current upsurge of reparation demands in the post-colonial context offers important connecting and comparative aspects. And the topic could be extended to approaching demands for reparations due to anthropogenic climate change, which is already on the table, and maybe in the future for the Ukraine, as Tanya mentioned. Thus, a topic that was originally dedicated to overcoming a concrete historical event of mass violence has meanwhile become an aspect of the debate on global justice, which also needs to be reflected upon. Thirdly, it seems important and promising to me to reflect on the development of the tension between individualization and collectivization in reparations for Nazi victims. For example, on the one hand, as Dandina has pointed out, the question of restitution after the end of the Second World War contributed significantly to imposing a collective understanding of the Jewish people. On the other hand, German compensation law took a strongly individualizing approach. After the end of the Cold War, on the other hand, a strongly individualizing concept of property prevailed, which is why the second wave of restitution, which began at that time in Eastern Europe, could also be understood as part of a neoliberal code transformation emanating from Eastern Europe and ultimately deeply affecting debates on restitution in Western Europe. At the same time, however, the reparations question moved into the context of an identity politics that argues strongly in terms of groups. Research into these contexts could thus make it possible to place the history of reparations more firmly in the overall context of research into central social and political dynamics in Europe after 1945 or after 1990, and thus also lead out of the occasional specialistic isolation of this topic. A fourth and last aspect I would like to promote here concerns the question of the history of the impact of reparations for victims of Nazi persecution. This is a question which we also have dealt with extensively in the context of a joint project, which maybe we might mention in some of the discussions. In other words, what difference does it make in the lives of those affected, whether and how they were compensated or not? So what are we fighting for? What are the intergenerational effects? And what do reparations for victims of National Socialist violence mean for the societies that paid them or the societies in which the compensated or non-compensated victims live? And what role does the passage of time play in this? So the role of temporality is important. This is perhaps a very personal perspective on the subject area. But after decades of dealing with this topic, I am increasingly preoccupied with the fundamental question of what can be moved and perhaps changed through legal procedures that open up symbolic and material claims for the victims of mass violence in a more or less remote past. And conversely, what are the limits of the possibility of repairing past events? This conflict also appears in the almost ritual criticism of the German term Wiedergutmachung. In my opinion, we are dealing here with questions central to the long-term treatment of National Socialism, but they are also significant for other cases of mass state violence. Historians will probably only be able to answer these questions, if at all, in cooperation with other disciplines. And historians also need to find a dialogue, to enter into a dialogue and communicate with activists and look to ways how to handle the already mentioned tension between general historical explanations and the importance of individual cases. So I will end with a warning to historians and also to a warning to myself. Historians should not fall again in the trap of the pathos of das Pathos der Nüchternheit, the pathos of sobriety, which was labeled by the group around Martin Brochard, which also to some degree has served as a mental shield against the allegedly subjective voices of victims. And I think we need to stand this tension, which is really important and decisive for this special topic. So with that in mind, I would now like to invite you very warmly to a discussion of my own considerations. Thank you very much for your attention.